Mr. President, 2 years ago, I spoke to a gathering of Friends of Israel. At the time, I was working to advance pro-Israel legislation to combat the BDS movement. This is a far-left effort to create worldwide anti-Israel boycotts. I was struck at the time by the opposition to the bill from the far left, and I said Democrats had to stand up to the growing chorus of anti-Israel voices in their own ranks, or we'd all come to regret it. Well, fast forward to today. Our friends in Israel are now in their second week of a difficult counterterrorism campaign. They're responding to unprovoked rocket attacks raining down on their people. Predictably, the radical fringe has leapt to excuse the acts of terror and, of course, blame Israel as usual. But now, disproportionate pressure is not only being placed on Israel by far-left activists, now sitting members of Congress are actually joining in. One Democratic House member has lately called Israel an apartheid state. Another said it's guilty of terrorist acts. For a long time, Republicans and Democrats have stood together in standing with Israel. I'm proud of all the work we've accomplished together, like improving Israel's Iron Dome defenses, providing precision-guided munitions and joint strike fighters, and collaborating on counter-tunneling technology to thwart terrorists. These bipartisan efforts have paid dividends for Israel and for the United States. As recently as 2014, during the last major conflict between Israel and Hamas, most Democrats stood unhesitatingly with Republicans to unequivocally condemn Hamas and support Israel. But now, rather than having Israel's back, senior Democrats have actually pressured Israel to end its defensive operations. They've called for a ceasefire and urged leaders to strive for peace through a negotiated two-state solution, as if Israeli prime ministers from across the political spectrum haven't made good faith efforts in the past toward peace. Of course, in this case, Israel's not fighting the Palestinian Authority. They're not up against the Palestinian Authority. They're at war with the Palestinian. They aren't at war with the Palestinian people. They're fighting Hamas. Now, everybody around here surely knows by now Hamas is a terrorist group that opposes a two-state solution. They want Israel destroyed. That's who this fight is between, Israel and Hamas. Not the Palestinian Authority, not the Palestinian people, Israel and Hamas. Israel versus terrorists. So let's just dispense with this both sides nonsense. Only one side has taken credible steps toward peace. And even when rocketed by terrorists, Israel takes extraordinary pains to avoid harming civilians. This includes, now listen to this, giving advance warning to Palestinian civilians in the places they're about to strike. Call them up in advance and say, get out of there, we're about to strike. Frankly, Israel's taking more care to protect Palestinian civilians than Hamas is, which intentionally hides behind innocent people in violation of the laws of war and then exploit their deaths to advance the cause. Hamas doesn't represent Palestinians any more than it represents the rest of the region's Arabs, which is to say, not at all. For decades, administrations mistakenly assumed the road to Middle East peace led through agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, that nothing else could be addressed until this was resolved. In reality, the previous administration facilitated the Abraham Accords, an historic step that helped Israel normalize relations with majority Muslim countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan. Morocco normalized its relationship as well. This is progress toward peace based on shared geopolitical and economic interests. And it came in spite of intransigence from leaders in Gaza. But now the Biden administration wants to deny this historic progress. A few days ago, the president's spokeswoman argued incredibly that with respect to the prior administration, quote, "We don't think they did anything constructive, really, regarding the longstanding conflict in the Middle East." Really? Recognition between Israel and 4 Arab countries is not progress? Give me a break. Now, as Israel battles terrorists, the Democratic chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee indicated this week he might try to obstruct the supply of precision technologies that help Israel avoid civilian casualties. How does that make sense? And remember, Chairman Meeks only chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee because the far left primaried the previous chairman, a staunch Democrat supporter of Israel, right out of his seat in Congress. You can see where the far left is trending. This effort to block arms sales is basically the same play that some Democrats ran with Saudi Arabia and the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. So let's just think about that. Fortunately, the latest report suggests the chairman may be backing down from this. I certainly hope so. But the White House still can't give a straight answer on whether and when we'll help Israel replenish the Iron Dome system that protects its citizens. Leading Democrats are even talking about easing sanctions on the Iranian regime that helps fund the terrorist proxies like Hamas and keeps their rocket arsenals full. They come from Iran. And the administration still proposes to cut our own U.S. defense funding after inflation. So listen, Israel's enemies are watching. Make no mistake, not just Hamas, but Hezbollah and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We cannot send the signal that terrorist attacks on American allies will be met with mealy-mouthed attempts to blame both sides.